Hey there, and welcome to Explosive Enterprises. Today we're going to take a look at another interesting 40mm shell design, this time from Acetech, the AceHive. While the AceHive shells are pretty interesting themselves, what sets them apart is that they're actually one component of a two-part system, the other part being a proprietary speed loading tool called the spawner. The system can be purchased as its individual components, i.e. a single AceHive or a single spawner, or as a package deal containing either 2 AceHives in a spawner or 6 AceHives in a spawner, in keeping with the industry trend of offering 6 packs of shells, presumably aimed towards folks that run rotary grenade launchers. Conceptually, the AceHive functions similarly to the vast majority of 40mm shells. You have a gas supply, a large plug valve with a trigger button disguised as the primer in the base, and a series of barrels that run around the perimeter of the shell head, which hold the BBs. Beyond that though, pretty much everything about this shell is just a little bit weird, and that's all to facilitate this funky yet extremely efficient loading system. Let's go from top to bottom as we tear this thing down. Starting with the head of the shell, the first thing of note is that it's made of plastic. In and of itself, that isn't all that weird, since plenty of 40mm shells have plastic heads, the classic example being mag shells like you see here. But they're generally made of engineering plastics like polyoxymethylene, which any machinist in our audience will know as Delrin. The AceHives, on the other hand, are made of clear plastic, so definitely not Delrin, and usually that gets us thinking either polycarbonate or acrylic. When compared to a piece of acrylic during a crush test, after both have been submerged in acetic acid, a small piece of the shell head shows a lot more softening, meaning that they are almost certainly made out of polycarbonate. Using polycarb here makes sense, since acrylic tends to be pretty brittle and wouldn't take well to being thrown around like 40mm shells tend to be. As for why they made it out of clear plastic, that leads into Acetech's other product line, tracer units, and though it isn't yet available in the US at the time of recording, Acetech is making a complete grenade launcher with built-in tracer unit, which they are appropriately calling the Volcano. The next unusual feature on the AceHive is this spring-loaded button up top. When you press that button, these 10 teeth force this O-ring onto these ramps, which stretch the O-ring out and seat it in this channel. This is done after loading the shell to seal the barrels off and to prevent the BBs from falling out. This design solves the problem that other 40mm shells with this barrel arrangement have, which is that the BB retention O-ring is always blocking the barrels, meaning that the force of something like a speed loader is required to get the BBs into them, massively slowing down the loading process. The side effect here is that this button and spring take up space in the central cavity of the shell head, which would ordinarily be used as the gas reservoir, and that takes us to the base of the AceHive. Acetech got around the reservoir problem by having the reservoir instead be part of the shell base, fed by this little tube that runs through the shell head with the fill port mounted at the other end of it. Unlike most shells, you actually need to remove the rim of the shell to access the plug valve and reservoir. When the shells are new or freshly greased, this is pretty easy to do, but after a few games and unscrewing it and retightening it a few times, that'll start to get pretty crusty and tough to remove. Acetech did helpfully provide these two holes in the base of the shell, and using a little 3D printed tool with a couple of M2 screws sticking out of it, we can use those holes to help unscrew the rim without needing to resort to a big pair of pliers. Once you get the rim unscrewed, for any of our fellow grenadiers watching this, we sincerely apologize if the sight of that many ball bearings rolling out of a shell gave you a heart attack or caused any mental trauma. Don't worry, we're going to go into how to reassemble these things in a few. So once we secure our many bearings and pull the shell apart, things look very weird, but in reality, this is just a different layout of the same poppet valve system used by most manufacturers. This spool would be the equivalent of this common style of plug that you'd find on most shells, with this one being from a mag shell. The difference here is that this spool actually contains the entire load of gas between the upper and lower sealing surfaces, whereas this plug is holding the gas back in a separate reservoir. Though it's in a slightly different configuration, the valve trigger on the AceHive functions in the same manner as the one from this mag shell, which is how the vast majority of 40mm shells work. When pressed, the valve button slides forwards and allows the bearings, which are holding the valve plug in place, to slide out of the way, allowing the plug, or in the case of the AceHive the valve spool, to pop open, releasing the gas into the head of the shell. All that said, from the end user's perspective, this design does have some practical implications. For starters, you have to deal with 3 times as many bearings, and they're smaller than normal. Most shells use 3 or 4 bearings seated in holes around the side of the valve plug. This shell uses 14 bearings resting in a track around the entire perimeter of the valve trigger, which rests in a cavity in the valve spool. Since they can freely move in this track, you need enough of them to actually fill most of the available space, or you'd have an uneven distribution of force. This design also results in a slightly larger overall load of gas, since the available space in the base is a bit larger than the reservoirs on other shells. This should theoretically mean a bit more power, but as we'll discuss when we get to performance, there doesn't really seem to be a noticeable difference between these shells and most others. Lastly, this design makes the shells a lot more difficult to trigger than you'd expect for one running on propane. Since the area of the lower sealing surface of this spool is so much larger than the surface area of a normal shell's plug, you have a lot more force resting on that valve trigger, which feels like it requires at least as much force to operate as a normal shell filled with CO2, and maybe even a bit more than that on a hot day. Since the process is completely different from a normal shell, we're going to go through how to reassemble these. Start off by inserting the valve spool into the main body of the shell base, making sure that both O-rings are seated. Then, insert the trigger button and spring into the base of the valve spool, and press it down slightly into the spool with your thumb, under a bit of spring tension. While holding the button down, use your other hand to place the 14 bearings into the track around the perimeter. It helps to slightly tip the shell to one side so that the bearings fall away as you place them in. And this is the tricky part. Take a pen or other similarly shaped object and run it through the hole in the base rim of the shell. Use that to hold down the valve trigger button while you slowly slide your thumb out of the way. Be very careful during this step since the bearings will fly all over the place if you release that button while it's under tension. Using your non-pen holding hand, slide the base rim into place on the other half of the base and screw it down as many turns as you reasonably can. Once you get a few turns in, the bearings are captive and can no longer fly all over the place, so you can remove the rod and tighten the shell rim the rest of the way down. Maintenance-wise, we'd recommend super lube on the O-ring in the base rim of the shell, all three of the O-rings on the valve spool, and the O-ring that seals the base of the shell to the head of the shell. The fill valves themselves can also be disassembled and lubricated as required. Avoid lubricating the BB retaining O-ring as it relies on friction to stay in place when loaded. As a side note, each shell comes with a rebuild kit, including a partial set of bearings and a full set of O-rings, which is an absolutely fantastic touch. More shell manufacturers should really start doing that. The other half of this system is the loading tool, which Acetech calls the spawner. This is split into two halves, a BB hopper up top, which holds around 320 BBs, enough to fill 4 shells, and a lower half that interfaces with the shell. To load the shells, you slot them into the spawner, press this release button, and rotate the bottom half, which allows BBs to fall right into the barrels. Then, press down on the top of the shell, click the O-ring into place, and you're all set. It is worth noting that you really don't need the spawner to load the AceHives. In fact, if you have a bin or bag of BBs to load from, it's pretty convenient to just dunk the shells in there a few times to load them, since you don't need to keep reloading the spawner itself, which is especially annoying when you have 6 shells to fill and only 4 shells worth of capacity. Of course, because everyone on this team is physically incapable of not fucking with things, we did 3D print a bigger hopper that can hold enough BBs to fill the entire 6-pack of AceHives, which you can find on our Thingiverse page, linked in the description below. Before getting into the AceHive specifically, we do want to make clear that we're not entirely sold on the practicality of 40mm shower shells to begin with. They have a very short effective range and very low power, so even at close range it can be a real struggle to hit fleeting targets, and it's even more difficult to get them to call the hit, though we have experienced people simply surrendering when they see the launcher you're carrying, thinking it actually hurts. Now, if we assume that you do want to use shower shells, from a practicality perspective, it's safe to say that the key feature of the AceHives is the way that they load. Acetech claims a 1-second reload time, which, if you're just counting the time to load the BBs, is actually pretty much on point, and that compares pretty favorably to the 40 seconds required to load a standard shower shell of similar design and capacity. Middling performance aside, the huge hassle of reloading is what makes shower shells so annoying to field, especially if you want to use them as your primary weapon in something like an MGL or other standalone launcher, where you're going to be firing them in rapid succession. It's therefore pretty tough to argue against the AceHives if you're looking for something to deploy en masse in a rapid-fire launcher, as you can quite easily refill a 40mm belt's worth of these between rounds, or when you head back to respawn. And as you'll see when we discuss performance, they do pretty much the same thing as other shower shells of a similar capacity. That said, there are a couple of things that could be identified as concerns for fieldability, namely the O-ring on the BB retention system, and the overall durability of this shellhead design. Regarding the retention O-ring, we have experienced it slipping out of place when the shell is loaded, which was a concern that we had from the outset just looking at the design, though the issue pops up a lot less frequently than we thought it would. Over the course of a couple day-long skirmishes, we only had 2 instances where that O-ring slipped out and dumped the BBs. That's not great, but not terrible either, as we've had similar things happen with the retention O-rings on conventional shower shells as well. Notably, in one of the 2 cases where the O-ring slipped off, it actually completely disappeared from the shell, leading us to believe that it probably wore out and just snapped. You can see how that happens since they're being stretched out repeatedly and the teeth on the shell bite into them fairly hard. Regarding the overall durability, while polycarbonate is tough stuff, what we're working with here is pretty thin, especially on the outside edge of the barrels, and these teeth are on the top of the shells. We don't have a ton of confidence that these would survive being dumped on hard concrete too many times without suffering damage that might make them non-functional. On the other hand, not everyone abuses their gear like we do, so your mileage may vary there. And honestly, since we haven't really been throwing these things around, the issue is more speculative than anything else, and I think we need some more time with these to really make a confident statement. As we noted, they perform pretty much identically to other propane-powered shower shells of similar capacity, which is to say, not all that impressive. They allowed their BBs in a wide spread that goes around 50 feet with the launcher held level, and practically speaking, maybe 100 feet if you arc the launcher considerably. It's worth noting that, like other shells with this barrel arrangement versus shells with a central cavity design that holds the BBs, the shot pattern is more circular, with only a small number of BBs actually going directly at the point of aim. I'm personally used to using shower shells with that central cavity design, which pattern in a more conventional manner, so I actually botched a couple of shots on small targets and windows before getting used to the AceHive's design. You want to aim slightly off target to get the best BB density in the intended area. So to bring this all together, for positives, you've got the obvious one, and that's that these shells do indeed reload very quickly. Even factoring in resetting and regassing, you're looking at maybe 10 to 15 seconds for each shell, which is far better than any BB shower shell that we've used before, and even rivals single projectile shells like tag-ins. Something we didn't really mention, but that we did notice, is that they mostly reset themselves, and when they don't, they're quite easy to reset manually. This speaks to them being well manufactured, and as anyone who has used cheaper shells can attest, that definitely isn't a given. It might also partially be down to the design, since having more bearings spreads the force more evenly around the valve trigger button than the 3 or 4 bearings on a normal shell do. And it's kinda neat that the head of the shell is clear so it can be used with a tracer system? Yeah, we're kinda reaching there, but this is the trouble with reviewing 40mm shells that have one big gimmick but are otherwise basically standard fare. For downsides, the speed loading design does unfortunately lend itself to dumping BBs out on occasion. As noted, that doesn't happen all that often, but often enough that it is worth pointing out. It's also worth noting that I personally do carry most of my shells in an exposed belt like you see here, so this might be less of an issue if you carry your shells in enclosed pouches. We'd be curious if anyone in our audience has experience either way, and if you do, please leave a comment below. Another thing with the design, we just aren't quite sold on the long-term durability of the shell heads. While I personally haven't run into any issues, I admittedly have been treating these shells with a bit more care than I would other brands. Again, we'd love to hear from folks that have a lot of trigger time on these that might be able to comment. And yes, we're going to whine about this in a lot of our 40mm shell reviews, but we've got yet another shell that isn't CO2 compatible. For this shell design and these materials, maybe that just wouldn't have worked, but it would be awfully nice to see more companies trying to design shells around being able to handle stronger gases, as it really makes a difference with performance. Finally, the trigger force on these things is pretty excessive for a shell that runs on propane. We've had a few hot weather games where these things became nearly impossible to fire without like 3 fingers worth of force pulling on the trigger, and just to make sure we weren't crazy, we did check some other folks' reviews, and lo and behold, you can see them having similar troubles as well. As we mentioned in the intro, the AceHive can be purchased as an individual shell, in a 2-pack that comes with a spawner, where you essentially get the spawner at a slight discount, and a 6-pack that basically throws in the spawner for free, price-wise. They certainly aren't the cheapest shells out there, but if you're heavy in the Grenadier game, you already know that this isn't going to be easy on the wallet, so the sticker shock might not faze you as much. And beyond that, there is definitely an argument to be made that the reload speed would be well worth the cost in certain applications. So that's it for this one. As usual, if you have any questions or want to let us know what you think of the review, leave a comment below. And if you're interested in supporting us further, check out our merch store linked in the description and pick up a patch or a shirt. Thanks for watching.